I used to think fighting was simple. You find the enemy. You hit it until it stops moving. If it gets back up, you hit it harder. That was the doctrine I lived by for 3 years, running the Gaiark back across every city they tried to poison. 3 years of burning exhaust and machine screams, and the particular smell of a barbaric machine beast when the engine soul that powered it finally went dark. It smelled like hot iron and something chemical underneath, something that didn't have a name in any language I'd learned. I got used to that smell, the way soldiers get used to smoke. What I was not used to, what nothing in my experience had prepared me for, was the day I arrived at a battle already in progress, and realized the men bleeding on the ground were not losing to a Gaiark weapon. They were losing to something older, something that had already chewed through a different war before ours had even started. That was the day I met Giant Kandu. And if you've never been outrun, outwitted, and outstubborned by a man who learned to speak from animals, you haven't truly been humbled yet. Let me back up. The Gaiark had been quiet for 3 weeks. That kind of quiet is not peace. It is the held breath before something bad. Ren had the sensor array running double shifts. Saki was cross-checking contamination reports from the river districts, and Gunpei was doing what Gunpei always did when he was uneasy, which was clean his sidearm until the finish wore off. Han had taken a part-time job at a curry shop somewhere in the warehouse district. I never fully understood how he held down civilian employment while simultaneously saving the planet, but Han operated on a frequency the rest of us couldn't tune to. Hiroto and Miu were running patrol sweeps in the G9 formation, silent and precise the way the wings always were, the way that used to annoy me before I understood that their precision was not arrogance. It was grief that had calcified into discipline. The two of them had been built for a war that never came and then thrown into a war that had no rule book, and they had adapted by becoming very, very exact. I was doing what I always do when I can't sleep and the enemy is quiet. I was driving. Speedor and I had worked out a route through the old industrial quarter that let us push hard without endangering civilians, a long stretch of elevated track that fed into a riverside road, then back through the container lots where the Gaiark had staged their first incursion 18 months ago. I ran it every few nights. Muscle memory. The way some men sharpen knives or do push-ups in the dark. Movement was how I thought. The alert hit my communicator at 3:40, pollution signature, but the readout was wrong. The contamination markers were scrambled, half Gaiark and half something else, something the system didn't have a classification for. Ren's voice came in immediately. Sasuke, Sector 9, be careful. The signature is it's not matching anything in the database. I was already turning. Sector 9 was a freight distribution zone, mostly dark at that hour, loading bays shuttered and container stacks throwing long shadows under the arc lights. I heard the fight before I saw it. The sound was wrong. I'd listened to Gaiark combat 1,000 times, the grinding hydraulic scream of their limbs, the specific percussion of a barbaric machine beast taking hits and shaking it off. What I was hearing now had that underneath it, but over the top was something else entirely. Something organic and fast, the rhythm of impact shifting so rapidly it sounded almost like music, like someone had set violence to a beat. I pulled Speedor up to the edge of the lot and got out. 3 people were fighting a barbaric machine beast I didn't recognize, built heavier than our usual targets, nunchaku assembly spinning off both forearms, the Gaiark aesthetic of industrial refuse and weaponized pollution stamped all over it. But the core of it was wrong. There was a faint biological shimmer in the plating, something almost organic layered into the machine construction, and the energy signature coming off, it made the hair on my arm stand up. Whatever the Gaiark had built this time, they'd used components they'd never used before. The 3 people fighting it were not my team. The one in red was the one I noticed first. You always notice the one in red, it's a leader thing, a gravity thing, something about the way combat authority sits on a person's shoulders. He moved like nothing I'd seen outside of archival footage, some style of fighting that looked on the surface like pure aggression, but was in fact deeply precise. Every hit landed in a specific place. He was reading the machine beast the way you read a road, looking 3 moves ahead, placing his feet exactly where they needed to be. He was good. He was very good. He was also getting killed. The machine beast, Nunchaku Banki, I'd learned the name later, had 2 modes that the Red Fighter hadn't fully cataloged yet. Up close it was a slugger, all mass and grinding force. But it had a chain attack on the left nunchaku assembly that extended far beyond what any reasonable chassis geometry should have allowed, and every time the Red Fighter pressed inside, that chain snapped out at an angle that broke the expected physics of the weapon. He was taking hits he couldn't account for. The yellow and blue fighters backing him up were good too, but they were covering his flanks rather than reading the weapon. Nobody on the field had figured out the chain geometry yet. I'd been watching for 40 seconds. Speedor, I said, you ready? Mach full force, Speedor said, the way he always said it, with that particular rumble that meant he was already calculating the intercept. I transformed on the run, cleared the barrier at the edge of the lot, and hit Nunchaku Banki from the left at a trajectory that caught the chain assembly mid-extension. The impact drove the weapon down and pinned the arc. For about 2 seconds, the machine beast had no effective counterattack. In those 2 seconds, the Red Fighter hit it 4 times in exactly the right places. Nunchaku Banki staggered back. It had not expected 2 different fighting doctrines arriving from orthogonal angles in the same half-second. Neither had the Red Fighter, honestly. He turned and looked at me with an expression that was several things at once: gratitude, assessment, and a pride that had been dented and was working out how to respond to that. Then the machine beast did something none of us anticipated. It activated a secondary system, an interdimensional shunt, jury-rigged into its chassis in a way that was either insane engineering or a trap we just walked into. White displacement light flooded the lot. When it cleared, the yellow and blue fighters were gone. The Red Fighter made a sound that I don't have a clean English word for. It was anger and fear and absolute refusal to accept what had just happened, all in one syllable. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at where his team had been. Then he charged Nunchaku Banki alone. I caught him by the shoulder before he got himself killed. He turned on me like I'd struck him, and for a moment I thought we were going to fight each other instead of the machine beast, which would have been spectacular timing. But he pulled up. He looked at me. Something behind his eyes assessed the situation and came to the correct conclusion. Nunchaku Banki retreated. It had what it came for, or it thought it did. It vanished back into the contamination field, and the lot went quiet. The Red Fighter stood in the silence and breathed. Your people, I said, we can find them. He looked at me for a long moment. You know about dimension displacement. I know about the Gaiark, and whatever that thing was, it was running Gaiark hardware. That means it has a Gaiark signature. That means we can track it. I held out my hand. Sasuke Esumi. He took it. His grip was like a machine press. Giant can-do. That was the beginning. By the time we reached SCRTC, the rest of my team had arrived, and 2 other fighters in purple and white, Geki Violet and Geki Chopper, names I learned in the next 90 seconds of extremely tense introduction, had found us en route. The handshakes were brief. The explanations were briefer. There was no time for the usual territorial friction that happens when 2 combat units meet in the field and neither of them wants to yield ground. Master Zia Fu was a small man with the bearing of a much larger one. He sat at the center of the SCRTC research bay and radiated a quality I can only describe as settled, the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of knowledge, but from the surfeit of it. He had seen things that made our current crisis look like a footnote. You could tell by the way his eyes moved when the situation was described to him. Dako Kyugen, he said when we finished, not a question. Mecha wants it. Geki Violet Goo, his name was Goo, Giant's teacher uncle rival something. The relationship was complicated, stood with his arms crossed and an expression that said he had hoped never to say this word again. Mecca is the last of Rin Ju Hall. He's been waiting. We thought the hall was finished. We thought Long was contained. That name, Long, I did not know it then. I would learn it. By the end of that day, I would have reason to remember it for the rest of my life. Ren had already cross-referenced the Gaiark data with the biological anomaly signatures from Nunchaku Banki's chassis. The fusion was precise, too precise to be improvised. Someone had understood both systems deeply enough to combine them. That kind of knowledge was dangerous in a specific, concentrated way. An engineer with two enemy doctrines in their head, working without constraints, building something that should not exist. Mecha is that engineer, Ritsu said, Geki Blue, quieter than the others, the one who filed information away behind careful eyes. He synthesized Rinju Hall's biological combat principles with Gaiark machine pollution technology. The result is Nunchaku Banki. Hant raised his hand. Is the Dako Kyugan in this building right now? Zia Fu looked at him with something that might have been approval. Yes. And Mecha knows where this building is. Longer pause, presumably. So, Hant said, we are sitting with the thing they want. In the building they're probably already tracking. Nobody said anything. Cool, Hant said, cool. We moved. Zia Fu opened the dimensional path. I still do not fully understand the mechanics. He explained it once, and the explanation involved his hands making a shape in the air that seemed to mean something very specific to Giant and absolutely nothing to me, and we went through. The other side was what I can only describe as a between space. Not another world exactly, not a parallel dimension in the science fiction sense. More like a layer underneath the world we knew, a substrate where the rules of contamination and corruption had physical weight. The sky, if you could call it that, was the color of industrial runoff. The ground had texture like cooling slag. The Gecko Rangers moved through it differently than we did. We were fighting men and women, trained, experienced, equipped. They were something that sat at an angle to fighting, something that had metabolized combat into a discipline that looked from the outside like intuition. Giant in particular moved through that space the way water moves, not picking a path so much as finding the one the terrain had already made available. I watched him and felt something I did not enjoy feeling. Something in the vicinity of inadequacy. Nunchaku Banki found us before we found it. The machine beast had been upgraded. Whatever Mecha had done in the interval had amplified the biological components. The Rin-Ju techniques layered into the chassis were no longer surface modifications. They had integrated. Nunchaku Banki hit Giant with a chain strike that moved in a pattern. I had no framework for biological reflex driving mechanical mass in a combination that shouldn't have been possible. Giant went down hard. The Gecko Rangers held, but holding was not winning. The chain attacks came in rhythms that varied just enough to defeat anticipation. You learned one pattern and it shifted. You adjusted and it shifted again, always one step ahead of whatever you'd figured out. Machine precision married to animal instinct. Mecha had built something genuinely new. That was when the pollution ministers arrived. Kegalesia, Yagastein, Kitnedas. I had scars from all three. They came in with Mecha at their shoulder, and Mecha was not what I expected from the intelligence summary. He was old by the reckoning of his kind. Old enough that the combat had left tracks on him, a weariness in the body that the eyes refused to accept. He moved like a man who had spent decades refining something in secret and was now delivering it to the world and waiting to see if anyone understood what he'd made. He looked at Giant and he smiled. "The Dako Kyugan," he said. "Give it to me, or I return your engines to you in pieces." The engine souls. My team's engines, Speedor, Buson, Beacon, Carrigator, Gunperd, Toropter, Jetras, Jumbo Hail Mach. Partners. Not equipment. Partners. The relationship between a Gaiark and their engine is not the relationship between a soldier and a weapon. It is closer to the relationship between brothers, or between a musician and an instrument that has been played so long it contains the music. The thought of those souls, those personalities, those presences, damaged or destroyed, produced a feeling in me that had no tactical component at all. It was simply grief, threatened and arriving early. Mecha was betting on that. He had studied us well enough to know exactly which lever to pull. Jian looked at the Dokugan in his hands. He looked at the engines held hostage. He looked at me. I wanted to tell him not to do it. I wanted to say that you don't give the enemy what they came for, that the calculus of the situation demanded we find another path. I'm fairly sure he could see all of that in my face, because Jian was, whatever else I thought of him in those first hours, an exceptional reader of human beings. He had learned to understand people the way I had learned to read roads, from fundamental principles, not from rules. He handed Mecha the Dokugan. And Mecha sent us home. The return transit was not gentle. We came back through the dimensional membrane like men thrown through a wall, landing hard in the freight lot where the night had started. The engine souls were returned, unharmed, as promised, because Mecha kept his word on the small things while engineering disasters on the large ones. I felt Speedor's presence return like heat coming back to a cold room, and I took one moment, one single moment, to put my hand flat on Speedor's chassis and breathe. Then I straightened up. "What is the Dokugan?" I asked. Jian was already on his feet, which was impressive considering what he just absorbed. "It's Long's prison. Long is inside it, was inside it. And Long is immortal," Gu said from behind me. His voice had a specific quality when he said that word, the quality of a man who had spent years making peace with an ugly fact. Long cannot be killed. He can only be contained. The Dokugan is the container. Mecha intends to use it somehow, to harness Long's energy probably, to amplify Nunchaku Banki beyond anything we've seen. I looked at Ren. Ren was already calculating. "We have time," Ren said. "The fusion process requires precise calibration. If Mecha is incorporating Long's energy into a machine chassis, the integration window is finite, based on the energy signatures." He glanced at his readout, then at Retsu, who was running his own calculations in parallel. The two of them exchanged a look that was the specific look of two analytical minds discovering they have arrived at the same number from different directions. 4 hours, roughly, possibly 6. "Then we use the time," I said. What followed was, without question, the strangest afternoon of my life. The Geka Rangers needed to teach us something. Not everything, not the full architecture of Gekajuken, which took years in the ordinary way, and which was in any case a biological discipline that interfaced differently with our mechanized fighting style. But the core of it, the engine of it, the principle underneath the system. Jian tried to explain it to me, and I understood approximately none of it. He did not explain it the way a teacher explains a thing. He explained it the way the wind explains a thing to leaves, by demonstration, by contact, by making you feel the force rather than articulate it. He grabbed my arm and moved it through a form I had not been taught, adjusting the angles with his hands until something clicked, not in the joint, in the understanding. For about half a second I felt what he was talking about. Then I lost it and we started over. Gu was teaching Gunpei, which was generating a specific kind of tension, because both of them had been the enforcer type on their respective teams, and neither of them had any interest in being the student. From across the lot I could hear them arguing about something that was technically about technique, and was substantively about something else entirely, about respect and precedence, and the particular pride of a fighting man who has earned everything the hard way and resents being told there is a harder way he hasn't tried yet. Ritsu had taken Ren aside, and they were doing something that looked less like martial arts instruction, and more like a graduate seminar, both of them talking quietly and precisely. Ritsu drawing something in the air that Ren was transcribing onto his readout. I had no idea what they were building, but the focus on both their faces suggested it was going to matter. Ran was working with Saki, and that session had a quality the other three didn't. There was warmth in it, something that recognized kinship. Two women who had fought in different colors for different causes discovering that the discipline underneath was the same. Saki laughed once, a real laugh, and Ran looked surprised and then looked pleased. And Hant was sitting with Geki Chopper, Ken. His name was Ken, the white fighter, the one who had arrived late to Geka Ranger's war and made up for it by training until his body had changed. And they were not doing anything that looked like training at all. They were talking. Hands moving, faces animated, something passing between them that I couldn't hear from where I stood. Whatever it was, Hant was nodding. Not the polite nod. The nod of a man receiving information that he will use. I went back to Jian. Again, I said. He looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize. It was the expression of a person who has found something interesting in an unexpected place. You are beginning to understand. I don't understand anything. I want to understand, that's different. No, he said with great certainty, it is the same. We were interrupted by Hiroto's voice on the communicator, carrying the specific clipped urgency he used when something had gone from potential to actual. Nunchaku Banki is moving. Mecha has completed the integration. Northeast sector. Civilian grid. I looked at Jian. He was already moving. The machine beast we found was not the one we'd fought before. The architecture was the same, the nunchaku assemblies, the industrial chassis, the Gaiark Kakugata hybrid plating, but the energy coming off it was different in kind, not in degree. Long's containment energy, forced into a machine body, had not simply amplified the weapon. It had changed its logic. Nunchaku Banki no longer fought like a machine. It fought like something that wanted to. The chain attacks came faster and with intent, reading combatants the way an intelligent adversary reads combatants, adjusting mid-strike not to a pattern, but to the specific fear and hesitation of the person it was targeting. It hit Jian in the moment before a counterattack, not during one. It caught Ran when her weight was already shifting away. It was not predicting moves. It was predicting decisions. We fell back. Hiroto and Mew arrived, the Goon wings, precise and controlled, the two of them splitting to engage Mecha, while the rest of us dealt with Nunchaku Banki. Mecha was formidable in direct combat in the way that engineers sometimes are, the kind of formidable that comes from understanding force so precisely that application becomes trivial. He matched Hiroto for 3 exchanges, which was not nothing. I pushed forward. I had 4 hours of the world's worst Gekijuken lesson behind me. I had a clearer picture of what Jian had been trying to teach me than I'd had at the start, which was not the same as knowing it. But there was something in my body that hadn't been there before, a different orientation toward the strike, a sense of the opponent's mass as something I could borrow rather than something I had to push against. It was incomplete, unpolished, but it was mine. I hit Nunchaku Banki with a combination that was half what I'd been doing for 3 years and half what Jian had been trying to show me all afternoon. The seam where the 2 doctrines met was rough. It was inelegant. It was deeply unpredictable, even to me. It worked. The machine beast staggered. It hadn't modeled this. It could predict Goanger technique because Goanger technique was consistent. I always hit from the right at this angle with this weight, following this sequence. It could predict Gekijuken because Gekijuken followed internal logic it had mapped. But this was neither. This was a conversation between 2 systems that hadn't finished learning each other's language, and the gaps in that conversation were exactly where the machine beast couldn't anticipate. Jian was on my left, and I didn't have to tell him anything. He'd seen it. He'd seen the gap I'd found. He came in on the opposite vector with something that was half Gekijuken and half something he'd pulled from watching me for 4 hours, an improvised mirror of the improvisation I'd just run. The 2 of us hit Nunchaku Banki from angles that didn't belong to either of our systems, and the machine beast had no framework for it. The others saw it happen and adapted without instruction. Gunpei and Gu hit simultaneously, two enforcer types whose afternoon argument had apparently resolved into something productive. Their strikes timed to the half-second with the precision of two people who had found, against their preferences, a shared rhythm. Ren and Retsu were running a pattern together that I recognized as coming from the seminar they'd been running by the wall, a flow between mechanical precision and biological adaptability that had Nunchaku Banki's energy reading completely defeated, because the pattern kept changing its own rules. Saki and Ran were a problem the machine beast actively avoided, which meant it was making choices, which meant it was being forced to think rather than act, and a weapon that has to think is a weapon that has already slowed down. Hant and Ken hit it while it was thinking. Nunchaku Banki went down. For about 4 seconds I felt the particular feeling that comes when a fight turns, not victory exactly, not yet, but the specific quality of a moment when you can see what winning is going to look like from here. The math changes. The weight of the situation shifts. Then Long broke free. I had not understood until that moment what kind of thing Long was. He did not burst from the Dakokyugen with violence. He emerged from it with the patience of something that had been waiting longer than the people around him had been alive, longer than the organizations that created them had existed, longer than most of the strategies they deployed had been conceived. He was a serpent intelligence, in the most precise sense of that phrase, not reptilian in the simple sense, but ancient in the way that patience becomes philosophy, in the way that waiting long enough becomes a kind of wisdom that has no interest in your shorter timeline. He looked at Mecha. He looked at Nunchaku Banki. He assessed the situation with eyes that had seen the end of more things than I could count. He discarded his vessel and flowed into Nunchaku Banki, as though the machine body were a glove he'd selected off a shelf. What stood up from where Nunchaku Banki had fallen was something that used the machine's architecture the way a skilled driver uses a vehicle, not limited by it, not defined by it, but working with it. Long Banki, an immortal intelligence in a machine body, with all of Long's pattern reading and none of a machine's limitations. Mecha, to his credit, understood immediately that this had not been the plan. The pollution ministers had already retreated. That was the tell. When the pollution ministers retreat, it is because the calculus has shifted beyond what they're willing to absorb. They had what they wanted and they were cutting losses. Mecha was alone. 2 figures arrived from the direction of the highway, moving fast. Not Goongers, not Gekka Rangers. Rio and Mio. I want to be accurate about what it felt like to see them. Giant had said their names earlier with a particular weight, and Gu had not said their names at all, which is sometimes more informative. Rio had been Gekka Ranger's most serious enemy. He had also been, in the end, something more complicated than that, a man whose capacity for the code he lived by had ultimately exceeded his capacity for the cause he'd served it under. He had died. That was not a metaphor. He was here. Meal at his shoulder, the way she had always been, the way that loyalty, when it is absolute and freely given and aimed at a person rather than a cause, sometimes outlasts death itself in the people who carry it. Rio looked at Long Banki. Long Banki looked at Rio. There was a history in that exchange that I was standing at the edge of, not inside of, and I had the sense to recognize that this moment was not mine. "You haven't forgotten," Long Banki said, with the specific satisfaction of an immortal intelligence that has spent considerable time arranging someone's suffering. "No," Rio said, "I haven't." Then he and Giant went in together. 2 Reds, 2 doctrines, brothers in a way that neither of them would have claimed, and both of them enacted without discussion. They hit Long Banki with a combination that was not an improvisation, it was a recognition. Rio had fought alongside Giant in the final days of the previous war. He knew how Giant moved. He knew how Giant thought. He knew where the gaps were and he filled them without being asked. The rest of us went to work on Mecha. Mecha fought well. He fought with the particular desperation of a man whose life project is ending, who has seen the thing he built turned against him by the intelligence it was supposed to channel. He was older than any of us, and he had waited a very long time for this day, and it was not going the way he'd waited for. There was something almost painful about watching him absorb the understanding of that. Meal hit him from the left. Hiroto hit him from the right. I came over the top and I used something I had not been able to articulate until this moment. The thing Giant had spent the afternoon trying to teach me, the engine Ken, my version of it, shaped by 3 years of machine combat and 4 hours of something older and stranger. It was not pretty. It was not pure Gekujuken, and it was not pure Go-Onger fighting style. It was mine. The specific product of who I was and what I'd learned and what I'd refused to forget, and what I'd agreed to absorb that afternoon in a freight lot with an alien biological specialist who'd learned language from animals. Mecha went down for the last time. Long Banky was still standing. This was the problem we had known was coming. The word immortal has weight in a fight. It does not mean what it means in stories. It does not mean the enemy is simply harder to kill, requiring a larger weapon or a more precise strike. It means the enemy has removed killing from the board as an option. It means the fight is not a fight about survival. It is a fight about containment. About the difference between destroying something and relocating it, between ending a threat and moving its perimeter back far enough that it can no longer reach you. Long Banky had the energy of Long's immortality and the architecture of a barbaric machine beast. It was getting bigger. Hiroto called the G9 formation. Engino rose over the skyline. The Geka Rangers were already in formation for Geki Rin Toja Wolf. Together, the two giants drove Long Banky back step by step across the industrial district, not winning, not losing, pressing. The scale of Long Banky continued to expand. Bay appeared from somewhere. I still have no clear explanation for Bay. He was a tiny flying creature who had apparently followed the Geka Rangers from India through a dimensional membrane, and I had stopped asking questions about the Geka Rangers' associated fauna, and began providing combat commentary in a voice 3 times larger than his body, with the relentless professional calm of a man who has announced more apocalyptic battles than he can count. Engino G9 wasn't enough. I called the G12. 12 engines, the largest formation we had ever fielded. The sky above the district went white with engine light, and then the formation was complete Geki Rin Toja Wolf, folding into the architecture of Engino G12, in a combination that neither team had drilled, that nobody had planned, that worked because both pilots trusted the math that 2 analytical minds had worked out that afternoon by a wall in a freight lot. Saidai Geki Rin Toja. I do not have adequate words for what it felt like to pilot that formation. The G12 was familiar, the weight of it, the footprint, the reach. But with Geki Rin Toja Wolf integrated, the formation had a different quality, something that moved between the precise and the intuitive in the same stride, something that borrowed from 2 doctrines simultaneously and was enhanced by both. Long Banky hit us with everything it had. We took it. We took it because there were 12 engines behind me, and 3 of the greatest biological combat constructs ever developed beside me, and because the people in those systems had spent an afternoon learning something from each other that they hadn't expected to learn, and because the machine beast's immortal intelligence, for all its patience and age and accumulated strategy, had not modeled this. It had not modeled 2 teams who had every reason to resent each other, deciding instead to listen. We drove the final combination through Long Banky's chassis at an angle that threaded the biological components and the machine framework simultaneously, unraveling both. Long Banky came apart. Long himself, the intelligence, the immortality, the ancient serpentine patience, poured back out of the ruined chassis like something returning to its natural state. Not destroyed. That was never going to happen, but compressed. Drawn back toward the Dokukyugen that Giant held out waiting, his expression the expression of a man who has done this before and would do it again as many times as it took. The Dokukyugen sealed. The silence afterward had a specific quality, the kind of silence that follows a fight that was genuinely close, where the outcome sat on a balance point, and you can feel, in retrospect, every moment where it could have gone the other way. We came down out of the mech formations one at a time, and nobody said very much for a while, and that was correct. Some moments require time before they can bear the weight of words. Ryo handed the Dokukyugen back to Giant. They stood facing each other for a moment. The man who had been Gekuranger's finest enemy and the man who had been its finest student, separated by a death and a great deal of history, and whatever complicated understanding had grown in the soil of both those things. Ryo said something, quiet enough that only Giant heard it. Giant's response was a single nod, the kind that carries more than it shows. Then Ryo and Meal were leaving, walking back toward whatever boundary separates where they'd come from and where the rest of us were standing. I watched them go and felt something I don't entirely know how to name, a kind of respect for a story I'd arrived at the end of, a story that had made the one I was living possible without my knowledge. "Where are they going?" I asked Giant. "Where they belong," he said, "for now." That was the whole answer he had, and it was enough. The birthday party for Natsume happened that night, in the SCRTC common area, with 2 teams crammed into a space built for one, and everyone making it work through the usual human mechanisms of proximity and food, and the specific relaxation that follows surviving something difficult together. Hant had made curry, which turned out to be the thing that unified both teams faster than any amount of shared combat had, because Hant's curry was exceptional, and its quality transcended factional allegiance. Gunpei and Gu were in the corner having a conversation that looked, from across the room, like the continuation of the argument they'd been having all day, but their postures were different now. The argument had transformed into something else, something that looked more like 2 men comparing notes. Gu said something and Gunpei snorted, which was Gunpei's version of a laugh. Retsu and Ren were at the table with a single datapad between them, still building something. I suspected they would continue building it by correspondence for months afterward, 2 analytical minds that had found a shared frequency and had no intention of abandoning it. Ran and Saki were talking the way women talk when they've decided they like each other, which is to say efficiently and warmly, and about things that actually matter. Ken and Hant appeared to have made a pact of some kind. I never found out what it was. Whatever it was, both of them seemed satisfied. Giant was sitting slightly apart from the main group, watching Natsume open her birthday presents with the quality of attention he gave everything. Complete, present, uncomplicated by whatever internal calculations most adults are running when they appear to be watching something. I sat down next to him. "You'll keep training?" he asked, not looking at me. "The engine can, yeah. It's your own style now. I showed you the door, you walked through it yourself. You showed me about 15 doors, and I walked through maybe 1.5 of them." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who knows more than he's saying and is comfortable with that. 1.5 is enough to start. We sat there for a while, the noise of both teams filling the room around us, and I thought about what the day had been. 2 groups of people who fought for the same reason, by completely different methods, who had been forced by a shared enemy into the proximity required to learn from each other. An immortal intelligence that had waited centuries and been sent back because it had not anticipated the specific thing humans do when they're out of options, which is borrow from each other, combine what they know, and produce something the enemy never modeled. Long had calculated everything. He had been patient beyond the patience of most living things. He had planned for the individual capabilities of his opponents and for their combined capabilities as separate units. He had not planned for the afternoon in the freight lot. He had not planned for two teams with no reason to trust each other deciding to anyway, in the 4 hours they had before things got worse. He had not planned for the rough seam where two fighting doctrines met, and something genuinely new came out of it. Something neither system produced alone, something that only existed in the gap between them. That gap is not nothing. I know that now. I knew it before in the abstract, but I know it now in the body, the way you know things that have cost you something. Natsum laughed at something across the room. The sound was clean and young, and the exact opposite of every sound the day had made before that moment. I leaned back and let the room be what it was. You fight for a long time, you start to think the enemy is the problem. You fight for longer, you start to understand that the enemy is a problem. But the other problem, the one nobody talks about because it's uncomfortable, and because it doesn't have a face you can aim at, is the distance between people who should be working together. The pride and the precedence and the territorial instinct that keeps capability separated from capability right up until necessity refuses to allow it anymore. Long had been patient for centuries. He had outlasted enemies who were better prepared than us. He had not outlasted a birthday party, a pot of curry, and 4 hours of the worst Gekajukan instruction ever given or received. I'm choosing to count that as a win. I didn't sleep well that night. This was not unusual. I have not slept well on a consistent basis since the first time the Gaiark hit a civilian district, and I arrived 17 minutes too late to do anything except help with the aftermath. 17 minutes is not a long time in most contexts. In that context, it was the longest 17 minutes of my life, and I have never fully forgiven myself for the time it took to get there, even though the rational part of my mind knows that the distance was the variable, not the speed, and the speed was already everything I had. The irrational part of the mind is a tenacious thing. I was sitting in the transport bay with Speedor, not going anywhere, just sitting, at roughly 2 in the morning when I heard footsteps. I looked up expecting Ren, who kept his own strange hours and had a habit of running diagnostic cycles in the small hours when the building was quiet. It was not Ren. Giant moved through the transport bay without turning on the lights, which should have been disorienting but wasn't, because he moved as though the darkness were just another kind of terrain. He found me the way you find a person in a dark room when you're paying attention to sound and weight, and the slight changes in air pressure that a body makes by existing in a space. He sat down on the opposite side of the bay, back against the wall, and said nothing. I said nothing either. This went on for a while. In my experience, silence with most people is uncomfortable. It creates pressure toward speech, toward filling the space. Silence with Giant was different. It was the silence of someone who learned language late and has therefore never fully taken it for granted, who uses words when words are the right tool and sets them aside when they're not. After maybe 10 minutes, he said, "You think about the ones you didn't get to in time." It wasn't a question. Yeah, I said. The Geka Rangers were the same. When Long was building toward what he wanted before we understood the shape of it, there were things that happened that we could not prevent. Ritsu still keeps a list. He has never shown it to anyone. He just keeps it. I thought about that. Does keeping the list help? I don't know. I think it is his way of saying that the cost was real, that the people it cost deserved to be remembered even by the ones who failed them. The transport bay hummed around us, Speedor idling, the systems quiet but present. I had spent more hours in this bay than I could count, waiting for alerts, maintaining equipment, doing the administrative maintenance that fighting requires and that nobody's stories ever include. The ordinary hours between the extraordinary ones. The life that happens in the margins of what gets written down. You said Rio hasn't forgotten his promise, I said. Earlier, what was the promise? Giant was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the answer came the way he gave most answers, directly, without preamble, trusting the listener to handle what was in it. When Rio died, the last thing we said to each other was not goodbye. It was a promise that what he had learned, what he had become, in the end would not be lost, that it would exist somewhere in the world in the people who had known him. A pause. He made me responsible for that. That's a serious thing to put on someone. He was a serious person. Were you angry at him when he died? Another pause, longer. I was angry at everything for a long time. I am very loud and it goes somewhere, the anger. For Ritsu it went inward. For Ran it went into discipline. For me it went outward and it was loud and it burned through and then it was gone. He looked across the transport bay at nothing in particular. What remained was what it covered, which is the usual thing. What's the usual thing? Missing people. I sat with that for a while. Outside the building, the city was doing what cities do at 2 in the morning, breathing slowly. Lights on in scattered windows. The night shift moving through the grid, trucks on the elevated road, and a helicopter somewhere to the east running its route. The world continuing its ordinary operation between catastrophes, which is most of what the world does most of the time, and which is worth noticing when you have been spending most of your attention on the catastrophes. Your engines, Giant said, they're alive. Yes. That's not common. In most kinds of combat you fight with things that don't know you're there. The weapon is a thing. For you the weapon is he paused, searching. A partner. Partner is the right word. I think that changes the fight. I think that changes what you're fighting for, when the weapon knows your name and chose to be here with you. I hadn't thought about it quite that way before. I'd thought about the engines as partners because they were. The experience of that was immediate and obvious, something you understood within the first hours of working with an engine the way you understand warmth or sound, directly and through contact. But I hadn't thought about what it did to the fight itself, to the mechanics of it, to the thing I was trying to protect when I went out. When you fight alone, you are protecting something abstract, a city, a civilization, a set of values. These are real things worth protecting, but they are large and diffuse, and the connection between your specific action and their specific preservation is mediated by many steps. When you fight with a partner who has chosen to be there, who has their own experience of the danger and their own response to it, the stakes become immediate. They become a face, a name. That specificity does something to the will. I thought about Speedor, the particular quality of Speedor's presence, the dryness of his humor, the loyalty that was absolute without being uncomplicated, the way he processed fear, not the absence of it, but the decision about what to do with it, and came out the other side of that decision the same as he'd gone in. I thought about all the nights we'd done the route through the industrial quarter together, not because it was necessary, but because it was what we did, the two of us. The way people who care about each other sometimes just spend time together without a stated reason. Yeah, I said, it changes the fight. Giant nodded. It was the nod of someone who already knew this, who had been asking the question to see if I did. Dawn came slowly, the way it does in winter, the sky lightening by degrees, the hard edge of dark giving way to gray, and then to a kind of thin gold that would take another hour to commit to itself. I noticed it through the high windows of the transport bay, the light changing, the city shifting from night mode to morning mode, with the reliable indifference of a system that keeps running regardless of what happened the day before. The rest of the teams came out in ones and twos as the morning assembled itself. Ran made tea. Ren made something that he described as breakfast, and that was in fact an extremely precise nutritional calculation presented in edible form, which everyone ate without complaint because the calories were real even if the cooking was utilitarian. Gu ate standing up, which I had noticed was his default, a man who was always positioned for departure even when departure was not imminent. Ken ate with the focused attention of someone who had learned to eat the way he'd learned to fight, completely, without waste. Goodbyes happened in the way of goodbyes between people who are not naturally effusive. Hands were shaken. Some words were said. Retsu and Ren exchanged contact information with the specific efficiency of two people who have already decided they're not done with a professional relationship and are merely formalizing that decision. Ran and Saki embraced briefly, warmly, and said something to each other I didn't hear. Gunpei and Gu exchanged something that looked from a distance like an insult, but had the cadence of mutual respect, which is sometimes the same thing. Jian was the last. We stood outside the transport bay while his team assembled behind him, the morning proper now, cold and clear, the city moving around us with no knowledge of what the previous 18 hours had contained. "Come train with us," I said. I hadn't decided to say it until it came out, but it was true, and the fact that it was an impulsive thing to say didn't make it wrong. Properly, not just 4 hours in a freight lot. "Come train with us." Jian looked at me with that assessment look, the one that came from behind the eyes rather than the face. "You would have to come train with us too." "I know. It would be difficult." "I know. You would fail at a lot of it for a very long time." "Jian," I said, "I drove a car into a dimension-displaced machine beast at 3:40 in the morning because the sensor readout was wrong, and I wanted to see what was on the other side. Difficult is not a thing that stops me." Something changed in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the internal thing that the smile is the surface expression of. He extended his hand, and when I took it, his grip was the same machine press it had been 20 hours earlier, and mine was too. "Then we will train," he said. He turned, and he and his team walked into the morning, and within half a block they moved with the specific quality they always moved with, not like soldiers, not like athletes, but like people who have so fully integrated their training that it has become the way they inhabit space, the way they breathe, inseparable from the ordinary act of walking from one place to another. I watched them go. Speedor pulled up beside me, idling low. "New alliance." "Something like that." "They're strange." "We're strange." "We're a specific and familiar kind of strange," Speedor said. "They're strange in ways I don't have categories for yet." "That's the interesting part. I notice you are making this sound like a positive thing." "It is a positive thing." A pause, the large one with the purple coloring. "Gu, he insulted my suspension calibration." "Gu insults everything he respects." "That is an unusual way to show respect." "Welcome to working with Gecko Rangers." I put my hand on Speedor's hood. "Come on, let's do the route." "We haven't slept." "Neither has the city." We pulled out into the morning and ran the industrial circuit, the familiar route through the elevated track and the riverside road and the container lots, the same ground I'd been covering for 3 years, which looked exactly the same as it always had and was, somehow, different. Not the ground, the person running it. I have been thinking about what it means to fight something that cannot be killed for a long time now. Long is still out there, contained, sealed, held in the Dakokugan in Giant's keeping, but not gone. The immortal things don't go. They wait. They accumulate patience like capital, spending none of it until the moment the account matters. What you do with a thing that cannot be killed is change the conditions under which it operates. You change the world it moves through until the world is too complicated, too densely networked, too full of people who know each other and have learned from each other for the immortal thing to navigate. Long had calculated for 2 separate teams with separate capabilities. Long had not calculated for what happens in the gap between teams when they stop performing their separateness and start actually listening. That gap is where we live. Every alliance is a gap like that, a space between people who have no necessary reason to trust each other, who have different methods and different languages and different histories, who are fundamentally shaped by different kinds of experience, and who choose, in the specific and limited and urgent context of the moment, to bridge it anyway. Not because it's comfortable, not because it comes naturally, because the thing on the other side of the gap is worse than the discomfort of crossing it. I know it sounds like a lesson. Most things that are worth knowing sound like lessons once you've learned them. Before you've learned them, they just sound like the name of the thing you don't know yet. The city rolled past. The sun came up fully, committing at last to the day. Speedor ran the route with the steady mechanical grace that was his particular quality, and I sat in the flow of it and let the morning be ordinary for as long as ordinary lasted. It is enough, sometimes, to survive the extraordinary and then return to the ordinary. To take what you learned from the collision and carry it back to the routine, where it sits underneath the surface of everything you do afterward, changing the angle of the thing without announcing itself. I learned something that day. I learned it in a freight lot badly from a man who had learned to speak from animals and who fought like water finding its level. I am still learning it. I expect to be learning it for the rest of whatever time I have, in the manner of things that are actually worth knowing. The route ended where it always ended, the container lots, the beginning, the place where the night had started. I stopped there for a moment and looked at the empty space where Nunchaku Banki had stood, where two teams had arrived at something together that neither of them could have managed separately. Just a freight lot now, early morning light on concrete, a few birds on the container stacks. "Same time next week?" Speedor asked. "Yeah," I said, "same time next week." We drove home through the morning. There is a thing that happens when a war goes long enough. You develop a relationship with the enemy's logic. Not sympathy, nothing so complicated as sympathy, and nothing so clean as pure opposition either. Something more like fluency. You begin to understand the way they think, the values that organize their choices, the internal coherence of a worldview that is opposed to everything you're defending. You understand it the way you understand a language you've learned as an adult, accurately, usefully, and always with a slight translation delay, always with the knowledge that there is something in the original that isn't quite in the version you've rendered. The Gaiark's logic was pollution, not as a metaphor, not as a strategy, as a genuine value system. They believed that the natural state of the world was to be exhausted, used up, converted from resource to waste. They were not wrong that this process occurred. They were wrong about whether it should be accelerated or resisted, but the internal coherence of their position had a certain kind of integrity once you'd spent enough time fighting it. They were consistent. They were committed. They had a very clear picture of what they were doing and why. Long's logic was different, and it was the difference that troubled me in the days after the freight lot. Long did not have a value system in the sense that the Gaiark did. Long had patience and the particular perspective that immortality generates, the perspective of something that has watched enough cycles to believe that cycles are all there are. No outcome matters because every outcome gives way to another outcome. No alliance holds because all alliances are temporary. No victory is real because the thing you defeated will reconstitute itself in some form, eventually, and the thing you protected will eventually need protecting again. From inside that perspective, human action looks like noise. Meaningful noise, possibly. Long had respect for human capability the way a geologist respects erosion, but noise in the end. Temporary configurations of force that would redistribute themselves across the longer timeline. What Long could not model from inside that perspective was the thing about noise that the immortal viewpoint misses. Noise accumulates. Noise builds. Noise becomes signal when enough of it is oriented in the same direction, by enough people who have decided, each of them individually, that the direction matters. Long had been waiting for the moment when the two teams would be too separated, too proud, too resource-depleted to function. He had waited with the patience of centuries. He had been wrong not because his patience was insufficient, it was more than sufficient, but because he had been modeling the two teams as they arrived, not as they could become in the 4 hours he gave them to prepare. You give humans 4 hours and a common enemy and a reason to listen to each other. You get something the enemy hasn't modeled, every time. That is the specific stubbornness that I keep coming back to in the years since. Not the martial capability, not the equipment, not even the will to fight, which other species have had and which hasn't saved them. The stubbornness about connection, the refusal to let difference be the final word, the willingness to walk across the gap between one way of knowing and another and bring something back. Long is still there in the Dakokyugen, patient, waiting, accumulating the currency of time. We are still here too, learning from each other, getting faster at crossing the gaps. I know which of those processes I'd bet on. After everything I've seen, I know which one is the more stubborn of the two.